Hello friends, and welcome to a new episode of Reality Check. Our age is dominated by the ephemeral and the transient. Cultural deconstruction runs rampant and looming nihilism seems to engulf all meaning and existence itself. Yet, the transcendent still manages to break through. Here at Reality Check, we inquire how to conserve the real in a time of deconstruction. In today's episode, we delve into the kaleidoscopic world of creativity, art, and morality, seeking to unravel the intricate threads that bind art and ethical considerations together. We'll try to peel back the layers of meaning behind artistic expressions and shed light on the profound interplay between various art forms and morality. Beyond these diverse mediums and methods, there lies a deeper quest for truth, a truth that transcends the creative process and resonates in the core of humanity. How does truth manifest in art, spanning from music to literature, architecture, and painting? And how does it shape our moral compass? Today's guest with me here is a Dominican friar, artist himself, philosopher, and theologian, Father Brad Elliott. Welcome, Father Brad, to the show.
Thank you, Dan. It's good to be here.
Now, you do really seem to be a jack of all trades, but I think we should start at the beginning. So what got you interested in art?
Yes, what got me interested in art was my family when I was young. I grew up in a very musical family, in an artistic family. My father was a musician, my mother was a dancer, and so this was it was always around. And then when I was young, a very young teenager, I just fell in love with music, particularly percussion and playing the drums. And I knew from early on, I think I was about 13 or 14, when I decided I wanted to be a professional drummer. That's what I wanted to do with my life. I loved certainly pop music. I fell in love with jazz, all forms of modern jazz. When in my teenage years, I studied I studied drums, particularly jazz drumming, at the conservatory level in college. And then after graduating from conservatory, I went to Los Angeles, California, to get into the music industry, to be a drum player. So the majority of my adult life, up until I was 27 years old, I was playing drum set professionally, drum set and percussion, mostly out of Los Angeles, California, doing a lot of studio work, a lot of jazz, a lot of pop music. And then because I was a younger man, I had the opportunity to tour with rock bands in the music industry for about 3 or 4 years. And that was certainly quite an experience, which is giving me a great spectrum of experiences. So I do have a background in music, in the arts, before I decided to answer this vocation, becoming a Dominican. So.
When you chose to play the drum set, was that what your parents had in mind, being also themselves musical? Because I can see that if your son plays, the violin or the cello or I don't know, the flute, it's nice. If he gets on the drum set, I don't know. What did they think about it?
Well, yeah, it's a good question. Yeah, most parents were like, "Well, can't my child play the piccolo or something like the drum set?" When I decided early on I wanted to play the drums, it definitely meant a change of lifestyle around the house, because you could always hear the sound of drums around the house when I grew up. And my family was incredibly encouraging, praise God. So my family encouraged me to play the drums, and they loved the fact that I was drawn to music and creativity from an early age. So they supported me with everything they had, praise God. So I never had any resistance at all from my family, even if they were not drummers themselves. They loved the fact that I was drawn to it. So,
very good. Well, it's probably good that they're not drummers themselves, because having a whole family of drummers, that may just turn into an impossible household.
Yeah, no sleep for anyone.
That's right. So I'm imagining you sitting in a smoky jazz bar, okay, with a beer, playing the drums, and then seeing you in a white habit as a Dominican. How did that happen?
I had been, like I said, my family had a very supportive family. My family they also raised me as actually a Protestant Christian. I was a Lutheran. Along with my love for music, I also developed a deep love growing up for our Lord, a deep love for the Christian faith. And when I was about 18 and 19 years old, I knew that to live a true, happy, integrated, healthy life as a human being, I needed to be committed to the Christian faith, committed to our Lord Jesus. There was no other way. And so I also, when I was a teenager, made that commitment to live my life as the best Christian that I could be. And that does entail, for a lot of Christians in the entertainment industry, for a lot of Christians that want to be artists, it does sometimes, on occasion, entail a kind of tightrope walk, unfortunately, especially once I got into the music industry itself in Los Angeles, California. When I was at the Conservatory of Music, I studied at the Cincinnati Conservatory of Music. When I was there, I became a Catholic. That's why when I actually converted to Catholicism. My study of the Christian faith, my deeper study of the history of Christianity, having the maturity to ask deeper questions. I would say ask the right questions. Got me to the point when I was 22 that I knew I needed to be Catholic. I needed to be a Catholic in order to completely follow our Lord Jesus. I needed to be a member of the church that he founded, and I needed to have access in my own life. I need to have access to the sacraments of the church, by which that grace, that absolutely necessary grace, the saving grace, is made available to me. So I became a Catholic, and so then at that point, from 22 on, I had what kind of would be what I call now, looking back on my life, conflicting loves and conflicting commitments. It doesn't necessarily have to be a conflict, but for me, it ended up, as I approached my later 20s, it ended up being a conflict. My love for music and my desire to be in the music industry, yet my desire to be ever more faithful to the Catholic faith. I had a growing desire in my heart to give my life entirely to our Lord. And then I realized by the time I was 27, and it's maybe it's fitting that I was 27. Most rock stars die when they're 27, I've heard. So I don't know, maybe for me it was 27. I needed to make some type of radical decision where for me, this is in my own life, this is not normative for everyone. This was for me, that I discerned in my life a very clear call towards the priesthood. I needed to make that radical decision to give my life entirely to the priesthood. And so I made that. I left the music industry, left professional music when I was 27, and entered formation to the priesthood. I was then ordained a Dominican. I was ordained a Dominican priest in 2018. So I've been a priest now for about 5.5 years. So,
all right, very good. Well, so you died to the world, which is good. Not final death, but just to the world. So that's a good thing. So you're still with us, which is nice. Now, you wrote a fascinating book, which really nobody that is interested in art or beauty or philosophy or even poemism can really get around. And in that book, you tackle a very interesting question. So I now want to get right to that core kind of question, and which is the metaphysical link, or just the link between art and morality. And I think there's a lot of landmines here that we can step on. And I just kind of want to open the floor for you. So what was the main idea behind the book that you wrote? And what is your answer?
Good question. Big question. So here's how I would begin. My interest in this subject began, of course, when I began formation for the priesthood. And as a Dominican, we study very rigorously the history of philosophy and the history of theology. And I'm a friar of the Western Dominican province, the province of the Most Holy Name of Jesus, where we tend to focus heavily on philosophy. And I had a fantastic philosophical formation in Berkeley, California. When I began my philosophical studies, I, of course, was by this point a professed Dominican, but I did not leave my love for music behind. I did not check my love for art or music at the door. And when I began studying ancient philosophy, what first struck me is that the ancients had a very rich and developed understanding of art, and a very rich understanding, a very nuanced understanding of the human person as a creator of art and all the different mediums by which that creation can come about, through either music or sculpture or architecture. And it was remarkably developed, but it was a tradition that was not only older than the tradition that I understood, but it was a tradition that I had not hitherto been exposed to. And that was surprising, particularly Aristotle, going through Plato, Aristotle, going all the way up through Boethius, and a lot of the later medievals or later ancients, late antiquity and early modernity. They had a very very developed understanding of how art imitates nature and how the human person as an artist, in a sense, is imitating the beauty that is seen in nature, and then ultimately for the Christian, imitating the beauty that comes from God. And I knew I wanted to explore that tradition. I wanted to explore that more. When I began exploring that tradition, going back to Aristotle, what struck me first was that for the ancients, art is not first in a product. Art is not first something outside the human person, as some kind of a thing made, whether it's a painting, a sculpture, or a building, or a piece of music. Art for the ancients was first and foremost a quality of the human soul. It was a habit. It was a good habit of the human soul that enabled the human person to add or to insert perfection into the external world. So art was first and foremost a virtue, an intellectual virtue that existed in the human soul that then received its expression through works of art in the world, what we now call works of art, whether it's painting, sculpture, architecture, music. And then there was this symmetry for the ancients between the work of art itself, the art that existed as a virtue inside the human person, and then that beauty in nature that the human person first received. Where the human person first receives and is receptive to the beauty of nature, and then through the virtue of art, through the virtue of techne in Greek, techne, where we get the word technical, was then able to reinsert that beauty or order back into creation through works of art. So,
what is a habit?
That's a good question. Well, a habit, a virtue for the Christian tradition is a good quality of the soul. So a habit, particularly the virtue would exist in the human soul, and it's a good habit that enables the human soul to perform actions that lead towards excellence in some way, some type of excellence. For the moral virtues, those habits, those good habits that we call moral virtues, prime the human person to perform actions that lead to their own excellence, that perfect the person morally. But there are also other virtues, not just practical, there are other virtues that, like the intellectual virtues, that not only prime the human intellect for acts of excellence according to its object, to understand truth, but also the virtue of art, which is a real habit that the human person can develop, that primes the human person towards works of excellence according to things made, to perform acts of making things, craft, that achieves a type of excellence that ennobles the world and ennobles the human person.
So let me get this right. So me as an artist, or just really as a person, I acquire a habit. So I do something repeatedly well, right? So I acquire a habit. This habit, if it has a good aim, is basically a virtue. Okay. And then by this virtue, the first thing that I perfect, and this is what the ancients would be in accordance with medieval thought and with Christian thought in general, is the perfection of myself, right? And then I'm this kind of now perfected human being, encounters the world and then forms something to be a work of art. Did I get that right, more or less?
Yes, yeah, that's correct. I would correct only, I would make a nuance in only one way. The ancients understood moral virtue, and the Christian tradition understands moral virtues, particularly as those virtues which perfect me, perfect actions that are perfective of me. So the moral virtues are distinguished from, let's say, the other intellectual virtues based upon where the perfection lies. So what perfection does the virtue aim at? Moral virtues aim at a perfection which is within my soul. Moral virtues perfect my soul. The virtue of prudence, justice, temperance, courage. These virtues make me good. But however, the virtue of art, for example, is not a moral virtue because it doesn't first perfect my soul. The virtue of art has its telos in perfecting the external world. Why it's a practical virtue because it's a virtue of making something. It's a virtue that ends in its practice. But the perfection, the telos of the perfection, is not within my soul. The perfection first is within external objects. This is the distinction between art and prudence, where art and prudence are both intellectual, practical virtues, but they differ with regards to where the perfection lies. The perfection of prudence is myself. My acts of prudence perfect me. But my acts of art perfect the external world. That's the distinction.
That's the distinction. Very good. No, that makes sense. You have a very beautiful, in this regard, in this vein, you have a very beautiful, explanation or description of the work of the artist. And I really like this, is ennobling material reality, right? So ennobling the matter. And when I teach Plato and my philosophy of art, something that I think most of the students get surprised by is that he talks about symmetry, he talks about harmony, which is obviously very important for any kind of art, right? There needs to be symmetry in order to have melody, in order to have harmonies. There also needs to be symmetry in order to have a building that looks beautiful. And in fact, you need symmetry also for a building that doesn't collapse, because if it's not symmetrical, it's going to collapse. Right? If one wall is kind of crooked, and that's not going to hold up very long. So in all arts, the symmetry and this harmony is very important. But Plato himself actually brings up the example of the most not the most important, but the highest harmony existing between, drumroll, soul and body. And it's so amazing that he says that, where Plato we usually call this dualist, right? In almost like this kind of kindergarten form, where there's like this cloud of ideas that we can never reach, and we're down here in this dark material reality. But Plato himself, I don't think, was that much of a dualist in that sense. And he did understand that there is a symmetry, there's a proportion between the soul and the body, first in me, obviously, but then also in us and the material world around us. So coming back to your description of ennobling material reality to be shaped beautifully, and how that soul material world connection is established, I just find very beautiful. Where did you get that formulation from?
This is a type of worldview that the ancient philosophers seem to possess almost by instinct. They understood that there was a harmony between the human body, the human soul, and then nature. And it was the human body that then, in a sense, it was human body, and particularly the human senses and the human ability to understand and be receptive to nature, that formed a kind of link between the human soul and nature. Also, the ancients had a very rich understanding of nature. In the modern world, we tend to have an understanding of nature, that word nature, I use air quotes, as something far less than what the ancients actually understood it was. We treat the word nature as something that human beings haven't yet touched. It comes it comes from the romantics. This understanding of nature is just what human beings haven't yet. So there's this automatically, for modern people, there's this divorce between humankind and nature. Once human beings touch it, once human beings come in with their civilizing power, it's not nature anymore. This is a complete contraction of how the ancients understood nature. And then with that understanding of nature, for modern minds, with that understanding of nature as something removed from the human person, if art is to be an imitation of nature, that would necessarily be a contraction of art. Art has to be just a spontaneous expression of something that comes from the human soul, independent of what is received from nature. And that's a real deficiency in our own modern understanding of art. But for the ancients, since there is a connection and this sympathy between the human person, the human soul, the human body, and nature, there is a type of, and we can really call it a type of proportion or beauty, a beauty that exists between the human soul and the human body, and then between the human soul body composite and nature. And recognizing that symmetry, recognizing that sympathy between all of these elements is part of the artist's calling. The real artist then is able to receive the order and symmetry and proportion of nature, and then put that reason, that ratio of order and symmetry back into the works that he makes, and then actually imbue and ennoble, I use the word ennoble, the material world with a greater share of that reason and order and symmetry. So the type of beauty, the type of symmetry and order that nature provides for us as a kind of menu of beauty, the human person, the human artist, is then able to take and amplify in his own way and kind of put on it the stamp of his own personality. And it becomes something even more beautiful, not because his art is removed from nature, but precisely because his art is a greater expression of what nature is already doing. And just if I can continue this line of thought real quickly, oftentimes when I ask my students, I have some students of philosophy, I ask them, what's the opposite of nature? Yeah. So because I'm trying to get them to think critically about this word nature and what we mean. I'll say, what is the opposite of nature for you? And it's always one of the precocians raises their hand and say, I know the opposite of nature. The opposite of nature is the artificial. That's what they assume. So you have nature on the one hand, and then you have the human artifact on the other. And those two are opposites. That's a mistake. That's a mistake. That's not true. That would be like, from a moral theology point of view, that would be like calling hatred the opposite of love. Hatred would not be the opposite of love. Actually, you cannot have the passion of hate unless that is first grounded on some deeper love that is there. In the same exact way, the human artifact is an expression of already what is a natural foundation. Art perfects nature. Art imitates nature and perfects nature. The artifact is unintelligible apart from a natural foundation. So what the opposite of the natural would not be the artificial. The opposite of the natural would be the unteleological or the unreasonable.
So
there's a lot there.
There's a lot there, indeed. But I love this. I love how you can show in this concept of nature, and especially in the modern misinterpretation of it. And this is really a reoccurring theme in this whole interview series that we've come to many times, is that one of the problems, really essential problems of modernity, is that nature is primarily turned into some material that we can mold and that we can command and that we have power over. And if we don't have power over it, we should seek power over it. Right? It's this idea of the kind of the industrial revolution. But you approach it from a different way, and you show us that there is a unity, so to speak, by way of art, right? And that the artificial, the artifice, right, the made thing, so the human made object, whatever it may be, is actually not opposed to nature, but is somewhat a result, if I may use that word, a result of nature that is mediated by the human spirit. So, okay, but if you say that the opposite of nature is the unreasonable, so like, what is that?
Ultimately, the unteleological, and that gets to a much deeper question about the nature, or about the reality of what we call nature, or teleology in nature. The opposite of nature would be the disordered and the unreasonable, because what we see in nature, what we encounter in nature, what the human mind is able to understand in nature as meaningful, is not simply repeatability, but true teleology, where the natures of things have purposes. They have purposes, and we see in nature a kind of symmetry between the way things are made and then the purpose for which they were made. Nature is moving towards a goal. And it is precisely this movement in nature towards goal-directed goods that actually strikes the human mind as being truly meaningful. And then it is this imitation, or it is this substratum of teleology within nature that the human mind is able to imitate in their art, in the art created through the virtue of art. And thus the artifact, there's a lot there. There's a lot of richness. The artifact itself is then connected to nature, not as just a replication of nature, but an imitation of nature. And that's also important. The ancients understood that they defined art as simply an imitation of nature. But an imitation of nature is not simply a replication of a material reality. That's important. Like a photograph. A photograph would just be a replication of a landscape or something. If an artist is imitating nature, the artist is not just imitating material reality. The artist is really imitating a reason, a ratio and an order and a teleology that he first sees in nature. So that is the robust and very large and grand image that the ancients had of art. Now, what we have done in the modern world, particularly since the Romantic movement, is we have separated the artist from nature, put the artifact in opposition to the natural, so that the artist himself, whether it's a fine artist or even a craftsman or a scientist in any way, is somehow competing with nature, trying to crack nature open to discover its secrets, almost as if it's a competition and not a sympathetic relationship. And that has led to so many perversions in the relationship between the human person and nature.
Huh. It's the Germans again with their romanticism. Well, I mean, now I'm gonna ask. So, as if these were not already difficult questions, I'm gonna ask you a difficult question that is also highly debatable and a highly contested subject. So get ready. All right. So, from what you're saying, it seems that there is, and I'm sure that in the book you expound this in much more detail, a clear relation of beauty, of art, and of morality. Okay, but if I listen to that, if I hear that, okay, and I look at art, I would say, well, does that imply that only a morally good person, a morally sound person, somebody that, I don't know, does not sin, does not commit evil acts, is actually a good artist? And I'm giving another footnote here. If you look at the history of art, it seems actually that that's not the case at all. Even the most kind of Catholic artists, think of Michelangelo or Caravaggio, who may be a better example, or Raphael, they were really tough personalities, and they had their share of fights and of mistresses and of strange relationships in their lives. So how is it? So what do you make of that? How do you make of a morally deficient person being a good artist, but still retain that there is some kind of connection of morality and beauty?
Fantastic question. This is the main question that students of art and morals always end up confronting, that relationship between the moral quality of the person and then the artistic quality of that which they're able to make. Is there some connection? But now it's important, and this is why the ancients were able to distinguish this. Aquinas distinguishes this beautifully. Art itself is an intellectual virtue. It's a practical virtue, but it is not a moral virtue, precisely because the location of the perfection that the virtue towards which the virtue aims. Art perfects the outside world. It perfects material outside of my soul. Thus, a person can be a certain person can have, let's say, very poor moral qualities. A person can be very morally stunted or morally backwards, and still have in their soul a very developed virtue of art. A person can be a great painter, a great sculptor, and still be kind of a jerk in their moral life. That's possible. That is possible. Aquinas uses the example in his reflections on morals. Can we call a robber good? Can a bank robber be a good bank robber? He says, well, in one sense, you could say a bank robber is good because he has the craft of robbing the bank. Right. A good bank robber can be good. He can be called good because he has perfected the craft of breaking into buildings and stealing money clandestinely. But that doesn't mean that he is morally good, because the choice that he is making, the way that he's using, I'll put in air quotes the word use, because this is the word Aquinas used, the way that his prudence is choosing to use his craft does not perfect his soul, but actually corrupts his soul. Hmm. Now, here is the connection then between art and morals. It's not because art itself is a moral virtue, but the moral person, once the person has developed moral virtue, the person can be more sensitive to the correct use of art, more sensitive and more aware of how to use his skill to create art that really ennobles the true human person and ennobles true human society, or does not corrupt society in any way, like we would call bad art or perverse art, perverted art would do. So we could call let's say I don't want to use any examples lest I draw out names, but some kind of artist which is creating, let's say, blasphemous art, or if a painter wants to create a blasphemous painting or some kind of sacrilegious sculpture, we can, in a certain sense, call the sculpture good if the sculpture was created with a high level of human skill. But we cannot call that sculpture or the artist good in the sense that he has properly used his art for a moral end. And so this is the distinction. And I do believe once an artist has himself grown in moral virtue and learned to put an image of that moral virtue into making good use of his craft, then that art itself, either those good sculptures, the good paintings, can in turn increase the sensitivity of other people to goodness. Because art does, I mean, taking it, when we consume art, when we consume good music, when we consume good literature, good movies, this does increase our own sensitivity to moral goodness. And so it can be a connection. The connection between art and morals can largely be in the effect of art, in that sense, not in the making of art itself.
Okay. Now, I have a follow-up question for this, and this is something that does come up in class. Now, I'm interested in movies, which is a sort of a Gesamtkunstwerk, right? It's a complete work of art because it does involve multiple, like, partial works of art, so to speak. Like, it involves music, it involves acting, it involves stage play, and so forth. Anyways, scenery. Now, what I've found in movies is there are certain movies that display or that show a problem really well. They show a human drama really well, or even a tragedy really well. And then there are other movies that give us a good message, like a feel-good message. And I'm not only talking about a happy end. I'm talking about like an actual kind of robust, meaningful message for life. And I kind of call those movies that you walk out of and you better person, right? I'm thinking of, like, I don't know, like Dead Poet Society or something. I'm using examples that obviously date me very well. But anyway, so like even Lord of the Rings, right? There's a lot of, and I'm sure that many would be familiar with that, even though it's an older movie, but there are many, one-liners in it or messages where somebody can actually translate those into one's life, right? Directly. So, okay. But there are other movies that show the tragedy really well. And I'm thinking of something like Requiem for a Dream. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but there's, that just shows. Yeah, or more recently, like The Whale would be one. But Requiem for a Dream is like my prime example for this. And it shows really the evil of addiction. And it does it really well from a, even from a cinematographic point of view, but also from a message point of view. It shows you that addiction is not just drugs, right? It's not just, no, it could be everything. It's sex, it's fame, it's pill addiction, it's medicine addiction, it's addiction to it's narcissism in a certain sense. It's a certain type of addiction of foreign, kind of approval. Anyways, but the movie ends in nothing, basically. It ends in a complete nihilism. So my question for you on this, I don't know if you can answer this easily, or if you can answer this at all, if it's actually a question that can be answered, but is there a limit where we would have to say, well, the movie, by showing us the tragedy, has to in a certain way show us evil, right? It has to show us evil. But then, like, is there a limit where we have to say, well, there's only so much evil that the movie can show us without being sinful, if that makes sense? Does that question make sense?
The question makes sense. It's actually that's a multifaceted question, but it's a fantastic question. If art is imitating nature, does the artist have an obligation? Let me try to rephrase the question. Let me know if this is getting to what you're saying. Does the artist have an obligation to imitate nature as better than what it actually is, or imitate nature as worse than what it actually is? And how does that change the human person? How does that change the human person? Art imitates nature. Art is an imitation of nature, but art is not a replication of nature. And that's why I particularly love that movie that you mentioned, The Requiem for a Dream, because it does, in a certain sense, imitate the horror of addiction without, in a sense, glorifying addiction. It does not in any way glorify or romanticize addiction at all. It perhaps exaggerates through cinematic technique the horror of addiction, allows the viewer to see and experience through all the different modes that cinema does, the horror of addiction. And in this way, it creates a very powerful message. And thus the consumer of that, media, the person who watches this film, can come away with a very acute sensitivity to how horrible addiction is. And I would say this is great art. That the art, the consumption of the art, was able to impress upon the soul something that does incentivize the soul away from addiction. It's a wonderful thing. Also, let's say certain very ennobling movies, Dead Poet Society, these type of things, they also imitate human nature. They imitate human virtue in a way which probably perfects or exaggerates human virtue in the real, as people are in the real world. But then because of that, the consumer of this film is able to come away with an ennobled sense of human dignity. And actually, the human person is incentivized to imitate what is seen in the film. And then the human person is incentivized to greater virtue. This is the power of art. This is how powerful art is. So this is the power of art, but also the great responsibility of the artist. Aristotle in his writings has amazing reflections on this. He talks about the ability of drama, particularly tragedies, to shape the human person in education as the human person is learning to develop virtue. And it's good for the young. He recognizes it's good for the young to encounter good plays, to encounter good dramas, good tragedies, because then the young, which are the most mimetic, particularly he recognized what we would now call teenagers as being the most mimetic of all. They imitate. So if they encounter or learn to encounter good drama, they will learn to imitate that virtue. They will learn to imitate the virtue because they see it imitated in art. And so this would be good. So if the artist, if the playwright or the filmmaker is able to imitate in perfect nature by exaggerating virtue, by showing human beings at their very best, this can then ennoble the consumers of this art, particularly the young. This is how Aristotle actually also distinguished, I forget what work it's in, I should know this off the top of my head, between tragedy and comedy. He says, generally the tragedies imitate the human spirit as better than it actually is, and comedy imitates human nature as worse than it actually is. And so then we tend to laugh at these people who are buffoons, or we tend to laugh at these people who are acting poorly, and that's why I forget where the work it is. He says that the young should not be exposed to comedy as much as tragedy, simply because the mode of imitation tends to imitate people as worse than they actually are. So.
Those are surely some high demands for the modern young generation. But I think, what you're saying is obviously rings true. And the evidence is that, young people are also the biggest consumers of said media. So, they're almost looking for the role model, right? And I think role model here would be the proper word, right? It's a model in the role that I'm supposed to imitate, right? As an artist on stage imitates the reality of a tragedy, so then the viewer, in a sense, also imitates the actor on the stage, and there's this kind of extreme deficiency right now in the artistic, in the artistic world, in a certain sense. I don't know if it's because of oversaturation or of deconstruction, but I'm sure it's a little bit of everything. Okay, so. We're kind of running out of time, but I would like to know. So you speak of a very high ideal, and you talk about the responsibility of the artist, but also in a certain sense of the responsibility of the consumer, of the viewer, of the audience, of those that enjoy works of art, whatever it may be. So would you say that there is modern art that actually embodies this high ideal that you're speaking about? And like, if listeners want to get in touch with it, like, what would you counsel them? What kind of counsel would you give them?
Well, good question. Certainly, we've already mentioned here a number of very good films that have come out even in the last few decades that imitate human nature to a very high degree, and they imitate the best of human nature. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Though they might certain films might show human beings in very tragic situations, but the films imitate those human beings and provide role models of the human spirit making the best out of sometimes very tragic situations, or allowing tragic situations to bring out very noble virtues in human beings. This is film at its best. When film can not only be created with great craft and be beautiful and have beautiful acting and great art and music, but also ennoble the human spirit by really encouraging the human spirit towards great virtue. In my own life, I have become far more sensitive in recent years to the power of good architecture, actually, the power of architecture to really shape human culture or to influence human culture for the best. The power of architecture, particularly sacred architecture, architecture of church buildings, to inspire contemplation, to put the human person in a posture where he is sensitive to the transcendent, the power of architecture through the creation of a sacred space, to make the human person and the human soul immediately desire the transcendent in a way that the human soul would not without that architecture. And I think architecture, more than any other, at least in the last few years, I've grown sensitive to this, is a real imitation of nature in this respect. Because what the architect is able to do is see the transcendence and the beauty that is in nature, and then create a space that then amplifies that beauty and that proportion and that harmony, and put the human soul in a type of space where it is more receptive to that beauty and harmony, rather than putting the human soul in a space which is kind of deadened from that harmony or beauty, or put the human soul in a space which takes that beauty and mutes it by just turning it plain, or mutes it by even working against it in a certain sense. And in this sense, my message, since we are running out of time, my message to artists would be to recognize your responsibility. Recognize your very powerful responsibility in whatever mode of art that you exercise, the responsibility that you have and the power that you have to really shape souls. So that's how I would answer.
Very good. Well, one of the buildings I'm thinking of, you explaining the natures, is obviously the La Sagrada Familia by Antonio Gaudí, right? Which does that in an extreme fashion, what he does. Yeah. So I'm actually going to close on an insider question, which is, you're from the Western province in the United States, I understand that, but will you as a drummer ever join the Hillbilly Thomists?
Good question. Surprisingly, I played 2 tracks on the very first album.
You did? All right. So you have already already advanced. You've been already there.
I play drums. I'm not able to play with them live because I'm in the West Coast and they're mostly on the East Coast. There's a lot of them. The Hillbilly Thomists are now in Rome, so I don't have a chance to play with them live. Maybe if they hear this, maybe this will incentivize them to invite me to a live performance. Hopefully, but I played 2 tracks on the first album. Yeah, so I am a Hillbilly Thomist.
Very good. You are one of them. You're one of the few chosen ones. Yeah. Very good. Father, you gave us a lot of food for thought. So thank you for that, and for artists and audiences and families. And so thank you very much for that. It was a riveting conversation, and I hope to have you back on the show sometime, and also continue the conversation. Outside of the interview session. I wish you all the best. And for everybody who's interested, go check out Father Brad's book. So thank you very much, Father, and I'll see you next time.